Good morning, everyone. Welcome to day 3 of Solar Week. If this is your first time joining us, I'm John Paul DeVersa, Senior Energy Planner with the Mid-Ohio Regional Planning Commission. We do ask that you keep yourselves muted and your cameras turned off to conserve bandwidth. Please use the chat feature on your right to submit any questions, and if we're unable to get to them during the presentation, we'll be sure to cover them at the end. All right, to recap. On Monday and Tuesday, we heard all about what's going on in our region regarding solar, especially large-scale solar developments, how local governments can be involved in the process, and about economic development from both the local government and the community perspectives. Today is the Community Solar Roundtable. Community solar has been used across the country to improve energy access and affordability. If you're not familiar with it, that's understandable since it's a tool that hasn't been used to a great extent here in Ohio. You'll hear from a couple of Ohio experts in just a moment. And then tomorrow, wrapping up Solar Week, we'll be discussing community choice aggregation with the City of Columbus and Smart Columbus Energy. The login information will be the same for tomorrow as well, so please join us if you're able. All right. And again, real quickly, plenty of MORPC resources available to help you as your communities consider solar developments in all of its forms. Check out our website or contact me directly for more information. All right, so I don't want to spoil any of the presentations today, but real briefly, communities across the country are finding success with the community solar model. Here in Ohio, however, we face a few barriers to its implementation. So with us today to speak to those challenges and also the successes are Dylan Borchers from Bricker and Eckler, Jennifer Spinozzi from Clean Choice Energy, and Jonathan Well from Cleveland Owns. And so Jennifer, I'm going to stop sharing my screen if you want to jump on.
Great, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Okay, can everyone see my
deck?
Yep.
Okay, I'm getting a little bit of audio feedback.
Echo.
Is audio. Okay, well, we'll just get started and please feel free to jump in. Thanks so much for having me today. I actually wanted to share that I'm delighted to be returning to MORPC. A number of years ago when I was in law school, I actually did an externship with MORPC, and that was my first experience working in government affairs, which really ultimately led to my career here in the energy industry and also working as the General Counsel and SVP of Regulatory and Compliance for Clean Choice. So everything really is full circle, and I'm just thrilled to be a part of this panel today. So I'm going to go over just some of the basics about community solar, give you a little bit of an overview of our company here at Clean Choice, and then also talk about what we've seen in a handful of different state markets that have enabled community solar, and give you a little bit of an overview of the customer experience. So Clean Choice Energy is a mission-focused renewable energy company. Our mission is to make clean energy accessible to everyone. We're a DC-based company, but I actually live here in Columbus, Ohio. We have more than 100 employees, and we serve customers across a number of different states, including Ohio. The background of our business is actually in retail energy or energy choice markets. So for a handful of years, we were only serving a limited number of customers behind the Duke territory, but just last summer, we expanded our footprint in Ohio. So if you live in one of the investor-owned utility areas, you've likely received direct mail from us regarding our clean electricity retail energy product. We're also a certified B Corporation, which means that we deliver on a triple bottom line and have made a commitment to do good in the communities where we do business. So what is community solar and how exactly does it work? So community solar is a shared solar model that's expanding in a number of states across the country. And essentially, rather than having individual homeowners or businesses put solar on their own rooftops, community solar developers lease or buy land and then build a solar facility that's accessible to a number of different participants. The energy that is generated by that facility is fed onto the grid, and then individual subscribers or participants receive credits on their utility bills that reduce the total amount that they owe, and then they receive a separate invoice for their subscription from the community solar provider. And the fundamental value proposition here is developing new solar facilities, and then also that participants are saving money. So typically those subscriptions are sold at a discount to the value of the bill credit. So participants are saving some money overall on their utility costs. So why community solar? Why is this market needed? It's still a pretty nascent business model. Why was it created? Essentially, it comes down to access. I think it's fairly well established policy in the United States now that individual homeowners have a right to install solar panels on their roof, but millions of customers in the US can't do that, either because they don't have a solar suitable house or because they're renters and they don't own their roof. So community solar was envisioned as a model that can enable customers to get access to the benefits of solar energy without having to install panels on their own property. There are 19 states and DC that have policies that enable community solar. Some of the biggest markets where we've seen really robust community solar programs are Minnesota, Colorado, and Massachusetts. The next states on that tier, New York, Maryland, New Jersey, and Illinois, are all states that have more recently enabled this business model, and there are a number of projects that are beginning to come online. In New Jersey, there was a big press release just last week. 3 years after the program was created, the first community solar program or community solar project was just energized last week in New Jersey. So that was really exciting. And then, of course, there are a handful of markets that are considering community solar policy. So some of the markets that we see as potential new markets for community solar are those ones listed in the third category, which includes Ohio. So when you think about enabling community solar, there are kind of some fundamentals. First, you need land so that you can build the solar facility. You need to have strong interconnection standards and practices. And then finally, you need to have some policy provisions in place that make community solar scalable. The ability to do one-off projects or projects in just very specific locations is not going to drive investment from the community solar industry. So these fundamentals are really what we consider to be the foundation of creating a more robust market. And Dylan's going to talk a little bit more about some of those policy specifics. So when you're thinking about community solar policies, there's an organization called the Coalition for Community Solar Access, or CCSA, and Clean Choice is a founding member of that organization, and I sit on the board of directors. But this organization has put together a really wonderful document called the Community Solar Policy Decision Matrix. And it outlines some of the various issues that need to be considered by policymakers when they're designing a community solar program. Program structure can vary in a number of different ways. The three primary ownership models are third-party owners, customer ownerships, which Jonathan is going to talk about a little bit more later, and then also utility ownership. The program size can either be capped or unlimited. When it comes to capped programs, there also needs to be a project selection process that's put into place, and various states have done that in different ways. It can either be a queue where projects have to apply and then sort of get in line. It can be a lottery where projects are selected randomly, or there can be an attribute-based model that kind of more individually selects projects. The compensation rate, both for the value of solar or the credit rate that our customers are going to receive, is really important. And then another compensation consideration is what happens with unsubscribed energy. If there's energy that's being created, that's being generated by the project, but there aren't enough participants to actually allocate that full amount, what's going to happen to that energy? The other big considerations are consumer participation. Most community solar programs require a minimum number of subscribers, and that can be anywhere from a minimum number of 10 to a minimum number that's several hundred. CCSA also strongly encourages that policymakers include residential carve-outs in community solar programs, so that we're ensuring that those small customers have access to the projects. There are a number of large commercial customers that also participate in community solar, but it's our belief that the residential customer participants is really what puts the community access element in a community solar program. So having that carve out is really important. And then most states have also passed or established some sort of customer protection framework, a set of minimum disclosures that are required at the point of sale, so that customers understand the product that they're buying, understand the value proposition, and have a clear understanding of the contract terms. And then the final issue is really about the development side of things: project siting, sizing. How big are these projects going to be? Are you going to be allowed to co-locate multiple projects on adjacent property? And what are the interconnection standards that are going to apply to utilities to make sure that the program can be administered efficiently? Now that we've kind of gone over some of the fundamentals of community solar, I want to give you an overview of some of the typical contract terms, and then share a little bit about what we know of the customer experience. So most community solar contracts are a pay-as-you-go subscription. They are longer term, typically 20 to 25 years, but you can transfer your subscription if you move within the same community, and you can typically cancel without any penalty if you move out of the eligible area. So for example, if there were a community solar program available here in my community of Columbus, if I moved from Clintonville over to Upper Arlington, I would be able to transfer my subscription seamlessly, and there would be no impact to my experience. If I decided to move to Chicago, I would be moving out of the eligible area for participation, so I'd be able to cancel my contract without any type of penalty. The size of the subscription is customized to the individual and is based on historical 12-month annual electricity usage. And then the subscription price can certainly vary, but what we typically see in the market is something between a 5 and 15% discount to the value of the credits that you receive. And we'll talk a little bit more about billing in just a minute, because that's certainly an area where customers tend to have a lot of questions. Something that's kind of unique about community solar is that enrollment typically occurs while the farm is still in development. Community solar development can take anywhere between 12, sometimes 24 months if you're talking about the full gamut of the cycle. And so typically we are signing up customers 6 to 8 months before the farm is actually going to be operational, or before it turns on. And then once the farm is operational, as we talked about before, the energy that's produced is fed onto the grid. The utility is going to apply credits to your utility bill based on your share of the farm, And then the month after that, your community solar provider is going to send you a separate invoice for your subscription. And in the end, customers are going to save somewhere typically between 5 and 15% on their utility costs. A few things that community solar is not. So as I talked about earlier, Clean Choice Energy is both a retail choice company and also a community solar provider. With community solar, customers are not going to get electricity directly from their solar farm. They're not changing their source or their supply. So in other words, community solar can work either as a standalone or it can run in parallel with a retail customer retail customer contract. Typically, community solar is not an investment or ownership in the facility. Jonathan is going to talk about an ownership model, and certainly that's something that we support, and we see that that has a lot of value, but that's not the version of community solar that we typically are seeing scale in the market. The advantage of third-party ownership is that subscribers don't need to worry about things like the installation, the maintenance, insurance, or operation of the farm. Community solar is not subsidized, it's not free. The credit that customers received is based on the value of solar that's being provided to the grid. And although we do anticipate that customers will save, there is, as I've said a couple of times, there's a cost to participate. There's a subscription fee that does apply. And then finally, it's not a green tariff. There have been a couple of utilities in the country that have proposed programs that use the phrase community solar because PR firms have shown that it's a phrase that customers really like and that sounds attractive to them. But community solar is not a program that requires customers to make some sort of upfront investment or pay a premium cost in order for their utility to develop a community solar facility. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about the customer experience. So billing is an issue that we hear a lot of questions about, and here's how we explain it. This is an exact example that we use for our customers in Minnesota. There, the utility is Xcel Energy. And so here's a sample bill from the customer's utility. They're going to have their normal electricity service charges, and then they're also going to have a line item credit. And in this example, that credit is $88. So the credit's going to be applied to the total bill and is going to reduce the amount that the customer has to pay that particular month. Then a month after the customer has received that utility invoice, they're going to get a community solar invoice from us at Clean Choice. That invoice is going to specify the subscription price multiplied by the kWh that was produced, and is going to also show their total amount due. So here's kind of an example of a side-to-side or side-by-side. Without community solar, this customer would pay $100. They would pay that directly to Xcel Energy, their utility. With community solar, in this particular month, since the customer got an $88 credit, their total amount that they're going to pay the utility goes down to $12. Then they're going to get a separate invoice from Clean Choice Energy that's for $84. The total that they pay is $96 instead of $100. And in that particular month, the customer saved $4. Another thing that's interesting about community solar is it is designed to provide savings on an annual basis. So it probably comes as no surprise. In the summertime, the sun shines more and the solar facility produces more energy. Bill credits are typically higher during the summer months. So what happens if a customer receives more credits than they can apply to that particular month? The credits are going to roll over to the next month. And then in the winter, when the solar facility is producing less and the customer is earning less credits in a particular month, those previously earned credits are going to be applied to that month's balance. Most utilities allow credits to roll over either indefinitely, or some utilities actually do a cash out on an annual basis. so that any accrued credits that have not been applied during the year are just trued up in a particular month. And then here's just an example of an annual overview that we share with customers. The environmental equivalency is something that is important to a number of our customers. So even though they're not directly using this solar energy that's been generated, they are contributing to the development of a new solar farm, and that has some pretty incredible environmental equivalencies. Last, why do we at Clean Choice love community solar? We truly think it's a win-win-win. It's a win for participants because it allows individuals who either can't or don't want to put solar on their rooftops to still enjoy some of the financial savings that go along with community solar. It's a win for landowners because of the significant lease and royalty payments that can be available to them. This year in Minnesota, community solar projects are going to pay about $5 million to landowners. And over the course of the 25-year term that's expected for rental or for land leasing, there are going to be more than 350 landowners in Minnesota who are estimated to receive a total of $182 million in lease payments. And then finally, it's a win for the community. Solar development means solar jobs. Solar jobs are good paying jobs. And also we're producing more 100% local, clean, and pollution-free energy. If you'd like to learn more, as I mentioned before, the Coalition for Community Solar Access is a really great business-led trade association. The Community Solar Policy Decision Matrix is a great resource, particularly for policymakers or policy wonks. And Jim Murray is the CCSA staff person that's focused on Ohio. So I've also included his email address here if you want to reach out directly to him. Solar United Neighbors is an excellent national nonprofit that represents the interests of solar owners and solar supporters. And they've also done some work around community solar. And then finally, if you're a landowner and you're interested in more information about potentially leasing your land for solar, the OSU Ag Law Extension Group has put together a really great resource and checklist that's available for landowners. And then as we transition to Jonathan, I'm just going to play a really quick, this is a 3-minute video that CCSA put together that talks about the benefit of community solar and specifically focuses on the experience of landowners that have leased their land for solar.
Jennifer, we're not hearing any sound on this.
Oh, drop. Okay. Well, I'll just stop it and I can, it's right on YouTube. So John, maybe I can just share the link with you and then you can share that with participants later.
Webinar in the background works. He's doing a solar week thing.
Hey all, this is Jonathan. I think if Dylan's on, he might be up next.
Yes, thank you, Jonathan, and thank you so much, Jennifer. This is Dylan Borchers with Bricker and Eckler. John Paul, can you go ahead and have me share the screen? Oh, it looks like I have that access.
Yep. Right
Great.
up on top. You got it.
Yep. Great. Can you see my screen okay?
Not yet.
How's that?
That's perfect, Dylan. Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you, everyone. Despite 10 months of Teams fun, still throw some curveballs sometimes. So to follow up Jennifer's presentation, which talked about the community solar model and her business's experience with that model, I'm going to talk a bit about the considerations in Ohio law with respect to community solar. So my part of today's discussion, we'll take a closer look at community solar landscape in Ohio and in particular the legal landscape. To start off, I'll first discuss the regulatory framework and considerations for community solar. And really underpinning any discussion about community solar in Ohio, or really any other energy issue in Ohio, you first have to examine where the project is with respect to the type of utility, whether that utility is an investor-owned utility, a municipal utility, or an electric cooperative. I'll also be discussing some of the relevant laws that may come into play for a community solar project in Ohio under Ohio's restructuring laws. Next, I'm going to dive into the issue of virtual net metering. As Jennifer talked about, this is really a foundational pillar for community solar, and whether some limited virtual net metering is in fact available under Ohio's current net metering statute. This is an unresolved issue in law yet. And finally, I'm going to talk about some of the trends in Ohio law that might point to an evolving energy landscape and an energy landscape that might be more amenable to community solar. So as you can see from this map, Ohio is a patchwork of electric utilities. There are three types of electric utilities in Ohio. We have municipal utilities, investor-owned utilities, and rural electric cooperatives. For municipal utilities, while privately owned utilities are regulated by the State Utilities Commission, municipally owned utilities are typically exempt from this state supervision. And the reason behind that is that there's a belief that government ownership effectively substitutes or provides regulation, and so that this local control is more sensitive to the local needs of those customers within the municipal utility service territory. We also have investor-owned utilities in Ohio, and these are the large electric distribution companies that issue stock owned by shareholders. The investor-owned utilities are regulated by the Public Utilities Commission of Ohio. In Ohio, the IOUs or investor-owned utilities are names that are really familiar to all of us. AEP Ohio, various First Energy distribution companies, Dayton Power and Light, and Duke Energy Ohio. Also importantly in Ohio, the investor-owned utilities are deregulated or restructured, whereby generation is no longer part of the vertically integrated monopoly and is instead provided by the marketplace. And finally, in Ohio, we also have quite a few electric cooperatives, and these are private nonprofit companies that are governed by its members. So community solar and its ability to thrive is largely driven by state law. There are a number of areas of state law that may come into play for potential community solar in Ohio. As I just mentioned, the territories of investor-owned utilities are deregulated or restructured, which means for these investor-owned utilities, the utility monopoly remains over the distribution system, but that the function of generating electricity and retail transactions are or might be provided by non-utility competitive entities. This competitive framework, for example, would allow non-utility actors to develop community solar and engage in retail transactions with consumers, the types of transactions that Jennifer just talked about in her presentation. So in this respect, Ohio has some of the building blocks for community solar in place. Another component that could be important to community solar in Ohio is the Renewable Portfolio Standard. Ohio passed its Renewable Portfolio Standard over a decade ago, requiring that 12.5% of Ohio's electricity supplied by the investor-owned utilities be from renewable resources, including an in-state solar resource carve-out. However, as many of you are likely aware, over the years, the RPS has been frozen and watered down, including in the most recent House Bill 6 bailout legislation, which is still on the books here in Ohio. For community solar, a strong renewable portfolio standard is important because it creates an additional value for the project renewable energy credits, which in turn creates better prices for community solar participants. As Jennifer talked about, net metering is critical for community solar, both to allow virtual net metering, but to also have valuable compensation for excess energy that's supplied through the community solar project. As I'll get into more detail, Ohio does not have an express virtual net metering provision. Further, as a result of a variety of rulemakings, the value of net metering compensation in Ohio has decreased over the years. Finally, within Revised Code 4928, there are a number of policy goals, a number of which would seem to encourage regulations to support the deployment of community solar, such as encouraging distributed generation and promoting innovation. And again, all of these components in Ohio law that I just talked about are within 4928, which is applicable to the investor-owned utility territories. Another important component of Ohio law that could come into play for community solar is the Certified Territories Act. And this law gives the utility the exclusive right to serve its territory. For the investor-owned utilities, due to restructuring or deregulation, this is the distribution system or the wire system. For rural electric cooperatives, however, this also means the exclusive right to make retail sales of electricity to electric load centers. And so this is generally meant that third parties cannot own generation and supply customers directly in those territories. And as a result, a community solar project would likely need to be owned by the electric cooperative within these territories. And then finally, importantly, the Ohio Constitution grants the right for municipalities to form and operate their own electric utilities. There's significant autonomy granted to these entities, which in turn creates opportunities for the municipal utility to be a platform for localized innovation and policy. So as I mentioned, I want to take a closer look at virtual net metering and Ohio law. One of the primary barriers to community solar is whether state law actually authorizes virtual net metering. Ohio has no dedicated virtual net metering provision. However, as I'll talk about in a moment, there have been legal arguments advanced within rulemakings that Ohio's current net metering law would actually permit limited virtual net metering. This argument has not been substantively addressed by the Utilities Commission. And importantly, in the discussion that I'll be providing here over the next couple of slides, this concept of limited virtual net metering would only apply to the investor-owned utilities and not municipal utilities or electric cooperatives. So let's take a look at the definition of net metering in Ohio current law. Here I've highlighted the portion of the definition which has been a focal point of the debate as to whether or not there is some permissible ability to have limited virtual net metering. The requirement that the net metering system be located on the customer generator's premises, certainly it appears from the language would limit widespread virtual net metering. So for unrelated businesses and individuals throughout a service area. However, there are positions that this limitation is not an outright prohibition on all virtual net metering. Instead, as the argument is posed, this language is flexible enough to accommodate virtual net metering and aggregation of multiple accounts of the same customer, regardless of where those accounts are located. And so the argument about this provision is just how limiting is it? And we had a chance to have some of this debate fleshed out in a rulemaking process that took place almost a decade ago. In 2012, the Utilities Commission initiated a rulemaking to address a variety of rules with respect to net metering. But as part of this rulemaking, they the Commission expressly asked whether virtual and aggregate net metering could be implemented within the existing net metering law. And so we had a variety of stakeholders comment on that very issue. And admittedly, I always cringe when attorneys pack this much information into a slide, and here I am guilty of it myself. But I hope you'll forgive me because some of these comments are quite interesting and really highlight some of the debate which is still outstanding in some respects in Ohio. There were a number of stakeholders that supported the notion that virtual net metering, at least some scope of it, was permissible under existing Ohio law. This stakeholder coalition involved solar developers, the Consumers Council, policy groups, environmental groups, the Ohio Manufacturers Association, among others. Just to highlight a couple of the points very quickly, and again, for those of you who would dive into this more, you can see all the comments on the docket, but as Solar Vision indicated in its view, there is nothing within the net metering laws that would prohibit aggregate or virtual net metering of a customer generator that has multiple customer facilities in an electric utilities service territory, so long as the net metering system is located on the premises of an owned, operated, leased, or otherwise controlled by the customer generator. Also, just briefly to highlight the comments from the Interstate Renewable Energy Council, the idea that there could be a common ownership component within the existing law could be especially beneficial to local governments. And so I wanted to highlight that for this group and the MORPC members. So just as there were a number of parties who advanced the notion that virtual net metering could be accommodated, at least in some form, under the existing net metering law, there were a number of commenters that opposed that view. In particular, the investor-owned utilities. They raised a number of objections. There was a practical component to the objections about the difficulty of facilitating that kind of arrangement. First Energy brought up various certified territory concerns, and both AEP and DPNL, as I mentioned, brought up just logistical and concerns about costs and other burdens to administer the program. So we had this whole process of comments and reply comments in response to the commission inquiry about virtual net metering. The commission, however, in that rulemaking decided to not weigh in from a substantive standpoint on that issue. Instead, in January 2014, indicated that it would open up a new docket specifically for this issue. To date, however, no such docket has been open. And so with the passage of time, it would be interesting to have this discussion. Certainly there have been some investments made by the utilities in advanced metering infrastructure. There have been changes in billing systems. And so just from a practical standpoint, it would be interesting if some of those objections that they raised in the 2012 rulemaking would remain today. So zooming out a little bit outside of that focused discussion on virtual net metering, there are a few trends that I wanted to highlight that seem to be indicative of a changing energy landscape or an evolving energy landscape in Ohio that ultimately, hopefully, is positive for community solar. First and foremost, we have at least one electric cooperative that within the last year started its own community solar program. As I mentioned earlier, due to the Certified Territory Act concerns, projects within electric cooperative territories will almost certainly need to be owned and facilitated by the electric cooperative. And so South Central Power Company has a community solar program. Frankly, I have not heard a lot about how it's actually working yet, but they've implemented this program. Another trend that's been really interesting to see over the last year or two is that community aggregation is increasingly focusing on how to support Ohio-based solar. We've seen that with the city of Columbus, Cincinnati, recently Grove City approved a ballot measure to aggregate with the goal of utilizing local renewable energy. And part of the emphasis is the goal of additionality, meaning that these aggregations actually drive new projects as opposed to just acquiring renewable energy credits out on the open market. We've even seen some brief references of community solar in some utility plans and proposed law. In Dayton Power and Light's recent distribution modernization plan filing, they actually proposed a community solar demonstration project. However, this proposal did not carry over to the settlement proposal that's now pending in front of the commission. Also, in the last General Assembly, there was a proposal to enable the investor-owned utilities to provide directly certain customer-focused energy services or products, and this expressly included community solar. And finally, just a couple of other trends that may be positive for eventual adoption of community solar in Ohio is that there's increased focus on the distribution system as a platform to manage distributed energy resources. This was a big focus of the Utility Commission's Power Forward process. The Power Forward Roadmap, which is the report that the Commission released after a very intensive workshop process, stated that more generally, state policy encourages the implementation of distributed generation through review and update of rules surrounding essential issues associated with the deployment of distributed generation, including interconnection standards, standby charges, and net metering. The regular review of these rules should ensure that new opportunities, such as community solar, are considered. And then finally, a trend that has been occurring in Ohio for some time, but we're just seeing it grow even more, is the utilization of the municipal utility as a platform for innovation and community priorities. A great example of that is the Minster, Ohio Solar and Storage Project. This was a first of its kind project, and admittedly near and dear to my heart because I had the opportunity to work on it. And so in the context of utilizing municipal utilities, it's my pleasure to hand the remainder of the presentation to Jonathan.
Great, thanks so much, Dylan. Hi everyone, I am Jonathan. I'm glad to be with you all today. I'm the Executive Director of Cleveland Owns. We're a small nonprofit here in Cleveland, and essentially we build cooperative businesses, and some of those businesses are related to solar. We'll talk about those. I'm joined today with a special guest, Sam Dickerson, who is a member of the BC, which is one of the groups that we've been supporting on a community solar project. And together we're going to describe that project. I think Sam's joining us by audio. I want to make sure that you can hear me okay. Sam, you with us?
Yes, I am. Thank you, Jonathan.
Great. Welcome, Sam. I don't know if you want to introduce yourself quickly and then we can describe the project.
Yes, my name is Sam Dickerson, and I'm a resident in the BC Block Club area and an integral part of the development of our solar project with the assistance of Community Owns.
Nice. Yeah, thanks, Sam. So I'm sharing my screen. Hopefully folks can see that okay. Yeah, just really quickly, Sam and I have a plan to describe the project that the BC is working on. And yeah, I don't know, Sam, if you want to kick us off with like some of the context around how your group got started and what's some of the vision that you all are bringing, like the transformation you want to see in Huff around this project.
Well, the project got started from a grassroots approach. Some of the residents in the area were sitting around reminiscing about what the Huff community experience has been like. And most people, when they think of Huff, they think about the Huff riots. And for those who don't know, we are a urban area in the inner city of Cleveland that's being redeveloped with new homes, new businesses, and things of that nature. Yet a lot of our residents don't have stakes in the community. They don't own. Most of them are renters and transient people. So what we wanted to do is build a community solar garden in the Huff area because we cherish Huff legacy, and we want to preserve our stake in its future. Also, we are looking to do a 9-acre solar garden with virtual net metering, as Michelle and Dylan had already talked to you about. And what we hope is to, through the subscriptions of what we get from the residents, as far as them being members of the BC Block Club Solar Initiative, we are looking to reinvest that money in our community to create other green energy opportunities and beautify our community to make it attractive to people to want to come in to be residents within our neighbor. We are looking to help people from low socioeconomic status to fluent status as well, because that's what our community is made up of now. But we don't want it to look, one area looks one way and the other area looks another. So we want to even the playing field for all residents within inside of our ward. And it is our hopes to acquire the land, and we are in talks and negotiations and having to go through all the red tape and things of that nature. And we are looking at how we're going to get our local power company, Cleveland Public Power, to buy into what we're attempting to do for the residents, as well as we are looking to get other communities like ours to have the same vision. Jonathan?
Yeah, thanks, Sam. That's a great recap. And so that's kind of, Sam brought up 2 points that are kind of wrinkles on what we've heard earlier from Jennifer and Dylan. The first is we're in CPP territory, right? So Cleveland Public Power has autonomy to set its own policies. And so the restrictions that we just heard from Dylan don't apply. In theory, CPP could allow this project tomorrow, just of their own volition, or Cleveland City Council could pass authorizing legislation to require Cleveland Public Power to authorize a project like ours. So we're open to both. We have not cracked that code yet, but because we have more political autonomy in Cleveland through CPP, we don't have to go through the PUCO, which is a much bigger lift. So Sam and I, there was a question in the chat earlier about how do you build kind of a coalition to win? Sam and myself in the BC, and here's a quick picture of some other members of the BC visiting a solar garden, a solar field down the block, which is not the garden that we're trying to build. We're trying to build a separate one, but we wanted to check it out anyway. Sam unfortunately did not make it in this photo, but you can see some of the other residents who are part of the crew. A really strong sense of leadership, a big vision they're bringing to this. Like this doesn't exist yet. And so the leadership within the BC has seen something. They have a vision for how they want to revitalize the community, as you heard Sam just describe. And I have personally found that very inspiring. For almost 3 years now, we've been working to write this business plan, put the pieces in place. And I'm excited. I'm excited about this project. I'm excited about community solar in general, if you can't tell. All the cool kids are doing community solar. There are awesome projects across the country. And I would be remiss if, my home state, Ohio, and specifically my home city, Cleveland, didn't get on that wave at the right time. And we'll talk a bit more about why that's so important. I want to share quickly kind of the 3 planks. I'm asking, see if Sam, if you're willing to talk us through kind of the 3 things that we're working on mostly. One is the funding for this project. So it's probably going to be $1.5–2 million to build this large 1.6 megawatt array. The second is we need a place to put it. So the land, Sam, you talked about that briefly. And then third is we need kind of this authorizing legislation. I don't know, Sam, if you want to speak to one or more of those, and I can fill in the rest, kind of where we are in the process of putting those pieces in place.
Currently, we have been meeting with city officials and people who are in different wards about acquiring enough land. Land is at a high commodity here in Cleveland now because they're rebuilding a lot of areas. So right now, we are in talks with the neighboring ward, and that's what's so great about virtual net metering. Once we have secured this land, we can move forward with our project. We have already secured some funding, and we're trying to use it to the best of our advantage because we understand that 9/10 of the law is ownership. So once we acquire the land, we own that, and it is our hope to own the panels. And owning the panels and owning the land gives us a great deal of leverage because we're in talks with a partnering company to fund our project initially, and we'll be able to buy it from them once they get the tax credits out of the project within 6 to 7 years. Yep. So currently, that's our plan, and that's what we're looking at doing.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah, thanks, Sam. I mean, on the funding piece, I'll just elaborate on that. What Sam, you just described is a partnership flip model. So there's an investment tax credit and accelerated depreciation. That is a tax policy that is written to benefit rich people. If you have a large tax bill, you're going to love that policy. You can put your money to allow you to make more money. That is, I'm not a wealthy investor. Sam and the BC is not a group of wealthy investors, and so we do not have the opportunity to take advantage of that tax credit, which means our plan is to partner with a tax equity investor, usually a large corporation, or in this case, a solar development company with connections to a large corporation, who is able to benefit from those tax credits and own the project upfront through what's called a partnership flip model. So they would have the majority ownership at the beginning. They would monetize the tax credit and the accelerated depreciation benefit. And then, as Sam mentioned, probably year 5, 6, 7, 8, somewhere in that range, we have to work out the details, ownership would flip. At that time, the BC, the group of neighbors, would finance a transaction to actually pay the tax equity partner for their stake, and the proportion of ownership would flip. 99% of ownership begins in the tax equity investor's hands. After the flip, the tax equity investor has just 1% or 0% of ownership, and the BC has that vast majority, 99 or 100% ownership. It's a way to, kind of a backdoor way, right, to monetize some of the tax credits. We want to approach that from the community perspective, which is how can you structure a deal like that? You know, in a system that is designed to benefit wealthy investors, how do you structure a deal like that that allows members of the BC, Sam and his neighbors and other folks to benefit economically, to see really transparent, you know, financing around this project. And that's what we're working through the details of. There's several national groups that do a really good job of that. One is the People's Solar Energy Fund, connected with Co-op Power in Massachusetts. They're sort of mentors of ours, guiding us through this process. We're charting new territory, so we're learning a lot, writing MOUs for our tax equity partners, working with the city to acquire the land, as Sam said, working with local community development corporations. And we think that we're putting together the pieces for a new model that we certainly hope in Cleveland. Again, I mentioned CVP could authorize this program unilaterally, or we could go through city council to pass legislation. We've worked with a pro bono law firm to write that legislation. That's our plan B if CVP poses more challenge than we hope. And the point is that we hope to clear this path not only for the BC and Cleveland, but we hope that it's an example, certainly for other cities with municipal electric utilities. A process like the one Sam and I are describing could very well work there. Now, at the state level, I think it's going to take a much larger coalition. Some of the folks on this call might be the right people to be part of a coalition like this. I know that, I know Chad, for example, whose name I saw on the participant list, does a lot of work around building a coalition. That might be one that helps us get over some of the legal hurdles that Dylan mentioned at the state level. In the meantime, we want to move forward at the city level, and other cities with muni electric companies can do something similar. Sam, I was going to move on to talk about kind of a little bit more zooming out, kind of the theory behind why Cleveland Owns is really excited about this. Sam, is there anything else that you think it's important to share with the group around the work that you and the BC are doing before we do that? Sam, are you there?
Yes, no, I'm sorry. My phone was acting up. No, you can go ahead, Jonathan.
Okay, cool. If there's anything, please chime in. I've just got two more quick slides. So Cleveland Owns, I haven't given the proper introduction. We're a nonprofit, and basically we incubate co-ops. And so this group, the BC, is one of the groups that we've worked with now for several years. We're working with a separate solar co-op called the Cleveland Solar Cooperative. It's a different model. It's not pushing for virtual net metering, but it is using collective ownership to own solar arrays on the rooftop of hosts. And the hosts receive savings through net metering and return 90% of those savings back to the co-op that covers its costs and pays back the member owners who invested with the co-op. And we're doing both those projects because we think it's essential that as we make this transition and deal with the climate crisis, make this transition to a clean energy economy, that we do so in a way that is just, that does not replicate the same inequalities, racial inequalities, economic inequalities, concentrations of power and monopoly ownership that our current extractive fossil fuel system uses. And one of the facets that's inspired us to approach it in that way is this framework I want to share from the Climate Justice Alliance, which describes a just transition as a process from leaving an extractive economy and moving towards a more regenerative economy. And this, framework, we won't have time to walk through it all, but I wanted to share this because it's sort of underpinning the approach that Cleveland Owns is taking towards asking the question, how do we electrify, right? How do we electrify the energy that we use? And not only that, we recognize it is not enough to just electrify. It's not enough. Beyond just electrifying, we also need to get out of the modes of operating in terms of enclosure, in terms of how we dispose of waste, in terms of labor exploitation, and actually shift from those modes to a more generative economic system. And community solar, if you ask me, is a really essential part of that. Because it does open up the benefits of solar to homeowners who right now don't have, or to households right now who don't have access to that, either for financial barriers, because their roof is not ready for solar, because they're shaded, any number of obstacles, as Jennifer has mentioned. But also it's a chance to rethink ownership. And at the center of that question, we understand that, as Sam said, 90% of the power essentially is in ownership. And so the question is, how can groups like Sam's be able to have a seat at the table and actually have ownership over these new energy assets that are going to be essential for us to make this transition to the clean energy economy. And in the middle there, you'll see there's a values filter. It's going to involve shifting mindsets. That's part of the work as well. Again, it's more than just electrification. It's actually finding a new approach to how we make decisions, how we work as groups, and how we repair historical harms that the old energy system has disproportionately impacted working class Black and brown communities. So because I mentioned that community solar is something that we think is an essential tool for that, especially in Ohio, I want to share a policy report. I think Gilbert's on the call. Gilbert is a collaborator on this, professor at Ohio University. And together we co-authored a paper with the Institute for Local Self-Reliance that came out about a year ago. And it describes, if you're going to do community solar, the devil is in the details. What are the details that can allow a community solar program to put forward the most equitable vision for how to do that program, where the benefits flow, who participates, and how the program is governed and structured. And so we did some of that work together with Cooperative Energy Futures, the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, and you can read about 30 specific policies clustered in these 4 areas: compensation, customer participation, program structure, and governance. Gilbert's contribution to this especially was in the discussion of the policy, and more specifically was in the economic analysis, which showed that for every $1 million upfront costs, upfront investment in community solar, you could generate about 10 jobs roughly, and about 1.7 million in economic impact statewide, right? So there's a positive economic output in addition to making this transition to a more equitable economic system and more equitable way to own and control our energy system. So I want to stop there and turn it back perhaps to John for questions from the group. I'm sure there are more questions in the chat that we haven't had a chance to get to. But again, my thanks for everyone's time. Glad to be with y'all and happy to stick around for some questions.
All right. Jennifer, Dylan, Sam, Jonathan, thank you very much. That was a ton of information. So let me see if I can distill it a little bit to perhaps give some perspective around some of those on the call that might not be as familiar or used to a lot of the language that we're using in this. If I am a homeowner and I want to put solar on my roof, that's a pretty straightforward process. Of course, not necessarily the cheapest, but it's something that I can certainly do. If all of my neighbors say, hey, that's a great idea, why don't we throw a system on the field across the street, and then we can all participate in that. We start to run into issues with investor-owned utilities, There is the lack of a virtual net metering policy, which would allow us to share that generation between the different accounts. If we're in a rural co-op, chances are the utility, the rural co-op would have to own the system. And then within a municipal utility, there's various problems that we might face depending on the location. I know we work with some here in the Barnstable region. So with that, and since we have quite a few local government members on the call, when they have community members who are looking into starting a community solar project, what are the best ways that they can help facilitate these? And so my guess is that it's probably going to be as a go-between, both for with the utilities and then also any regulating entity, whether that's the PUCO or someone else. And any of you who feel comfortable taking a dive at kind of guiding our local governments in community solar considerations, I'm open to every perspective.
Well, I'll jump in at that. That's the reason why we decided to do it on the ground, because we wanted everyone to have access to it. And traditionally, it takes about $20,000 to put that on your roof. And some of the roof structures in our community can't handle it. So the virtual net metering allows people to tap in from other parts of the area, and you can expand it depending on how much usage you need from the solar panels. So that concept of you wanting to share with your neighbors is a great idea, because it cuts down on the investment for each person. And because you can afford it, you can help out someone who may not have the 20,000 plus to put that array on his or her roof. Anyone else would like to chime in?
Yeah, thanks for the question, John Paul. I think if I understand your question correctly, I mean, you're sort of talking about what's the political process, or like what's the process for getting through all these barriers in different jurisdictions. And if that is what you're asking, and I understand it correctly, I mean, our strategy for that in Cleveland is by building a political coalition to win. And that starts by centering the voices of residents who've been most impacted by an energy system that leaves them with bills that are too high and homes that are not energy efficient. And from there, we believe building out our connection of allies, that's through institutions and other neighborhoods and other folks who see this solution, this community solar policy solution, as a way to address that going forward and also repair some historical harms. And so our core nucleus of that strategy is grassroots engagement. It takes a lot of relationship building. It takes a lot of meeting time. It takes a lot of strategizing. And from there, we believe that we're going to be able to build a political coalition that includes city council people. We've talked with the mayor of Cleveland about this, and essentially generate that bottom-up support that we're going to need to shift the policy in a way that allows us to achieve what we're going for.
Great, thank you. So we had a question come in. This is a great question, and I honestly am not familiar with the answers. So perhaps Jennifer, Dylan, again, Jonathan or Sam, if any of you have input. But what are the risks to subscribers, especially as we continue to see solar prices go down at the utility scale? We know investing in projects right now might actually lock you into a higher rate than if you just waited a few years. Other risks along those lines, or any other thoughts that you might have as far as what about subscribers in this?
Sure, I can chime in on that. I mean, I think if you're talking about a customer ownership model, the risks might be very unique and specific, right? It's about investment, it's about that access to capital, it's about potentially an obligation to maintain the system over a longer term. So those risks might be fairly unique. In a third-party ownership model, the risk really is just ensuring that you as a participant understand your contractual terms. What we have seen in the market are typically products that are priced at of what we call a floating discount to the value of the credit. So even if your credit rate goes up or down, the price that you pay is going to track that in parallel. So most of the contracts that we see in the market, even if they don't include a guaranteed savings clause, the customer should expect to save roughly 5 to 15%. Now, obviously, I mean, there's a big caveat there. You need to make sure that that is the pricing structure that you're signing up for. There are other pricing structures that are out there, but that's what we've seen. And in that context, I think generally the risk to consumers is fairly low. Early termination fees also do exist in some contracts, and we've seen those range anywhere from $100 to $500. So if for some reason you decide, a few years into the contract that you just don't want to participate anymore and you're not moving and you're canceling for convenience, there might be an early termination fee that applies to that, because with third-party ownership, it's really essential for the financing of the project and for the investment of the long-term owner that project be fully subscribed. So if someone has signed up and then they decide to cancel, that owner needs to find a replacement customer in order to kind of realize the full financial benefit of their investment. So, I mean, really making sure that you understand the contract, making sure that you understand the pricing, and if a early termination fee applies, those are really the key risks in my view. And I think several states have done a really, really good job of creating customer protection rules and some standard disclosures that require community solar providers to be really upfront and transparent about those terms.
All right, we got another one. How does third-party ownership solve problems of projects being built now, being undercut by lower cost? Sorry, hang on, there we go. How does third-party ownership solve the problem of projects being built now being undercut by lower cost projects in the future? So similar to what I was mentioning before with installation prices continuing to go down and expected to go down, how can we mitigate some essentially a stranded asset for some of these customers?
Yeah, I mean, I would say the third-party developers, their investment is driven by the financials that they see today. So in essence, I mean, if a project doesn't pencil now, and for the for the foreseeable useful life of the project, which is typically somewhere between 20 and 25 years into the future, then it's not going to be built. So I don't really think, I mean, certainly there is an opportunity that 5 or 10 years down the line, projects can be built more cost efficiently, but a lot of community solar developers, they do business in a number of different states. So if the project economics, in Ohio don't work today, then they're going to go build in Maryland or New York or one of the other states that I mentioned until it gets better here. And I think that's really just understanding those various market dynamics is really just what drives investment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can build on that. I mean, in response to James's question, I don't think that third-party ownership does solve the problem of the deflationary nature of pricing of solar right now, right? As prices come down, everybody waits until the price gets lower and lower and lower. There's a climate imperative that I think is a good motivation not to wait. There's also the fact that, you know, the reason these projects are getting built at all is you can lock in those economics over a 25-year period by getting subscribers and other financiers to agree to the rates that are current at the time. That's not to say, as Jennifer said, in 5 years, prices might be 25% lower. On net, that would be a good thing. It might make your project look a little less smart, but you still are able to, you know, hold, you know, the people have still signed contracts that allow them to allow you as a financer to fulfill your commitments and get your return through that. I don't think third-party ownership is an elixir to that, as a magic elixir to that. If, you know, the utility might put that money up front and find themselves in a very similar situation, for example. Third-party ownership, however, does attract outside capital, so you're not just expecting the utility to put all the money up front. Instead, you can bring private capital to the table, and then specifically, hopefully, community capital to the table as residents have a chance to get in on this upside around solar.
All right. Sam, did you want to add anything to that?
Not at this time, thank you.
You got it. All right. So one other question came in. This is a good one. How does the utility benefit? So as we know, utilities have shareholders that they're responsible to. Jennifer, as you mentioned, these projects have to pencil out. They have to make sense. So we have two non-IOU utilities here in the Morpsey region. Sorry, we have two municipal utilities here in the region, Westerville and City of Columbus. I know for City of Columbus, there's a lot of back-end improvements that need to be made in order for these projects to make sense. What are you seeing as the benefits for the utilities? What is kind of that tipping point around the country that, you know, utilities are just going, yes, this makes sense, we need to go forward with it? How do we get them on board?
I mean, actually, Dylan is probably best suited to take on the issue with the local utilities. I'll say just very briefly, from my experience in dealing with investor-owned utilities, they agree to it because of a change in law that requires them to. And so it's not necessary. I mean, certainly there is some partnership that happens in terms of the legislative process and, you know, coming to terms and negotiating a bill. But in my experience, you know, there's never been an investor-owned utility that has simply done this as a matter of convenience to the customer or to industry. They do it because legislation has been passed that requires the policy to be implemented.
Yeah, Jennifer hit the nail on the head. Utilities have to often be directed by legislation. You know, just like net metering is available, just like the ability to have rooftop solar for your own purposes is permissible under Ohio law for investor-owned utilities. Those things all had to be required under statute. I would caveat that, though, with the observation that if the investor-owned utility could somehow rate base this, they might be interested. And I think we saw some of this in House Bill 247 from the last General Assembly, where the investor-owned utilities were supportive of legislation to allow them to do a lot of things on the customer side of the meter, including own community solar. And that really highlights some of the tension in Ohio with respect to the investor-owned utilities and the competitive marketplace. You know, who gets to own what? where does the marketplace and competitive suppliers have primacy? That's always an area of tension. So bottom line, investor-owned utilities can be instructed by law to do it. With respect to the municipal utilities and electric cooperatives, I think their incentive primarily is that they are driven by local government, by voters, and for the electric cooperatives by their members. So looking at those governance structures and how to advance member interests would probably be the primary approach to pursue community solar in those territories.
Yeah, I'd agree. I mean, there's definitely a political angle to this. I would offer some technical benefits. There's a case to be made that distributed generation, reduces transmission costs, allows for innovative strategies on the grid like microgridding and more local distributed generation. So we're not all when the power plant goes down, we don't all see the cuts to our power. If battery is the future of the grid, like these local, like Minster, Ohio, found a way to do a community solar scale project with storage, battery storage, so they can reduce their peak demand. And I think that's one of the clearest incentives that we've seen motivating Cleveland Public Power. They're paying this heavy demand charge, capacity charge from the grid. And if they can, shave off any bit of the prime usage capacity during those minutes of the day, like that's worth it for them because it adds up over the rate they pay over the whole year. So there are some financial incentives, but certainly I think that this shift is how about this? I do not trust that First Energy is going to lead us on a shift in the right direction towards community-owned, community solar, right? It's going to be a political fight, and in fact, you're seeing monopoly utilities fight tooth and nail to keep their power and privilege over the concentrated version of our energy generation and distribution system that we have now. And it will be a fight every step along the way for us to peel their hands off of that control. And you're seeing the result of what happens when we don't challenge that power through the $60 million scandal around HB6. That's certainly true at the IOU level. At the municipal level, I think it's a little more complicated. Again, you have a political lever. But also more generally, I think it's time for municipal electric utilities to ask themselves a big question on what is their role in a clean energy economy? What's the value of them? For example, why is Cleveland shipping hundreds of thousands of millions, potentially millions of dollars every year out of this state to buy power from coal plants and hydro plants at very expensive rates in upstate New York when they could be paying their local residents to generate clean renewable energy right here in our city? So the question is, what is the purpose and structure of a municipal electric utility? And I think if the purpose and structure of an municipal electric utility is to promote economic development in a clean energy economy system mindset, then they would be approaching this question. They would find their incentives, drastically realigned. And I believe that with a new generation of young leaders coming of age in Ohio who recognize the urgency of the climate crisis, many more municipal electric utilities will find it in their souls to reevaluate their role.
Yeah, that's a great point, and Gilbert kind of touched on those impacts yesterday when we were talking about the economic impacts of solar and in keeping that energy local. One last question. I think that's all we're going to have time for. This is a really, really important one too. I'm glad it was asked. So when it comes to equity, yes, we have climate issues that we're facing. At the same time, we have historic injustices. So we have the past and the future kind of putting pressure on us from both sides right now. Why should we pursue community solar instead of projects such as more affordable housing, other recreational facilities, something like energy efficiency, because we know that's a huge problem in Ohio. Is it a one or the other situation? Is it something that we can do all at once kind of thing? And certainly Sam and Jonathan, but again, Jennifer and Dylan, if you have any insight on this, this is a big one.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question, and I see Rory's question in the chat. I just put a quick response, but this is a land use policy question. Unfortunately, as I showed on that framework before, we've been in an extractive mode around land use for a very long time, and I hate to say this, but Central Ohio is one of the biggest offenders of this, right? It's one of the lowest density counties, of the urban counties in the state, and our solution in Ohio and in the United States in general, starting with manifest destiny, has been just spread, right? If you have a problem, just spread out. And so now in Cleveland, that spreading included generations of white flight. And so we have deeply disinvested neighborhoods in Cleveland. And like some of the land that we're looking at, it's 20 plus square acres of land that has been vacant for more than 30 years. So the question is, how best do you use that, taking in different layers of equity? And I'm not convinced that the answer is always community solar. I would not suggest ground mount solar on the 2 square miles of vacant brownfield that we have in the city. But I would suggest that of those 2 square miles of vacant brownfield, there are a lot of acres that can go towards community solar owned by the residents who live next door to those, who are literally profiting and getting clean renewable energy from those arrays. So there's a broader question around how do we reduce sprawl? How do we use an Oregon model of fencing in with an urban growth boundary and allowing farms and solar panels to exist on the other side of that fence, right? Take up, kind of shift our mentality and our modalities around land use. And certainly I wouldn't suggest that every vacant lot in Cleveland we need to cover with solar panels, but there are some that will make sense for us to do. And I think that we should be open to that. The other thing I just want to add quickly is that, putting solar panels on the ground doesn't necessarily mean that land can't be used. In fact, there's a really big movement among ground mount solar arrays to plant things like wildflower gardens, right? So you can have a green space that is contributing positively to the local environment and have solar panels above that. There's another version of that where there are sheep grazing underneath the panels. I mean, you can do kind of fun and creative things that mean that the land is getting multiple uses in addition to generating clean energy, by the way, that we need to keep our planet alive. So there are real competing imperatives that I think are worth having a detailed conversation. And that conversation is best done, I think, in a larger conversation around how we have abused land use in the past and what it means to repair that harm and change those practices going forward.
Yeah, I agree with everything that Jonathan has said. Just to add a couple more, a little bit more feedback or another perspective. I mean, we actually tend to hear a lot of interest from communities in developing more urban areas. And the unfortunate reality is, from a third-party ownership perspective, that type of brownfield development or developing on commercial rooftops tends to actually be more expensive and sometimes just not workable as compared to greenfield development. So, I mean, certainly there are a lot of various considerations that need to go into place in terms of greenfield development and how much greenfield should be either reserved or, should solar development be allowed on. I think one really important key consideration with solar, particularly ground-mounted solar, is that it doesn't actually disturb, the land. You can build a solar facility out, on 20 acres. You can have it run for 20 to 25 years. And then we go in and we take it all down and that land can be returned to farmland or redeveloped in some other way. So there definitely is, there's a temporary nature to this development that I think does provide a unique benefit to landowners. And as Jonathan mentioned, a lot of community solar developers are getting super creative with dual uses of land. We have a couple of different farms that are pollinator friendly. We have farms that have honey houses that are built, that are on the property as well. And so then solar honey gets developed. A friend of mine works for the company that owns the developer that's doing a bunch of the sheep grazing. That's really fascinating. In Massachusetts, there have been cranberry bogs that have been developed under solar. So there are a lot of really creative ways to really maximize use of the land in conjunction with solar development.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys very much. We're at 11:30. Dylan, a very special thank you to you for pulling all of this together. Jennifer, Jonathan, and Sam, thanks for joining us. It was very nice to meet you and get your perspectives on all of this. For everyone still on the line, please join us tomorrow as we talk with the City of Columbus and Smart Columbus Energy about aggregation, the new program, and possibly regional perspectives that we might bring into this. All right. Thanks again, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day.